Welcome back, students. How are you all doing? Okay, so we had stopped at the gender, literacy, and culture of the Roman Empire. Today, we will start with the economic expansion, the economic activities of the ancient Roman Empire. The empire had a substantial economic infrastructure of harbors, mines, quarries, brickyards, olive oil factories, etc. Wheat, wine, and olive oil were traded and consumed in huge quantities, and they came mainly from Spain, Gallic provinces, North Africa, Egypt, and to a lesser extent, Italy, where conditions were best for these crops. Liquids like wine and olive oil were transported in containers called amphorae. I've shown you a picture of this before. I'll show you all again. The fragments and shards of a very large numbers of these survive. Monte Testio in Rome is said to contain the remnants of over 50 million vessels, and it has been possible for archaeologists to reconstruct the precise shapes of these containers. They tell us what they carried, exactly where they were made by examining the clay content and matching finds with clay pits throughout the Mediterranean. In this way, we can now say with some confidence that Spanish olive oil was a vast commercial enterprise and reached its peak in the years 140 to 160. The Spanish olive oil of this period was mainly carried in a container called Drizzle 20. If finds of Drizzle 20 are widely scattered across sites in the Mediterranean, it suggests that Spanish oil circulated very widely. Such evidence of the remains of amphorae of different kinds and their distribution maps, archaeologists are able to show that Spanish producers succeeded in capturing markets for olive oil from their Italian counterparts. This would only have happened if Spanish producers supplied a better quality oil at lower prices. The big landowners from different regions competed with each other for control of the main markets of the goods they produced. The success of Spanish olive growers was then repeated by North African producers. Olive estates in North Africa dominated production through most of the 3rd and 4th centuries. Later, after 425, North African dominance was broken by the East, and later in the 5th and 6th centuries, the Asian, Southern Asia, Syria, and Palestine became major exporters of wine and olive oil. And containers from Africa show a dramatically reduced presence on Mediterranean markets. Behind these broad movements, the prosperity of individual regions rose and fell, depending on how effectively they could organize the production and transport of that particular goods and on the quality of those goods. The empire included many regions that had a reputation of exceptional fertility. Campania in Italy, Sicily in Fayum, Sicily, then Fayum in Egypt, Galilee, Byzantium, southern Gaul, and Boeotia. They were all among the most densely settled or the wealthiest parts of the empire. According to the writers like Strabo and Pliny, the best kinds of wine came from Campania. Sicily and Byzantium exported large quantities of wheat to Rome. Galilee was densely cultivated. Every inch of soil had been cultivated by the inhabitants, and Spanish olive oil came mainly from numerous estates along the banks of the river Golunquir in the south of Spain. Large expanses of Roman territory were in a much less advanced state also. For example, transhumance, that is, the herdsman's regular annual movement between the higher mountain regions and low-lying grounds in search of pasture for sheep and other flocks. Transhumance was widespread in the countryside of Numidia. These pastoral and semi-nomadic communities were often on the move, carrying their oven-shaped huts called mapalia. As Roman estates expanded in North Africa, the pastures of those communities were drastically reduced and their movements more tightly regulated. Even in Spain, the north was much less developed and inhabited by a Celtic speaking peasantry that lived in hilltop villages called Istela. When we think of the Roman Empire, we should never forget these differences. We should also be careful to imagine that because this was the ancient world, their forms of cultural and economic life were necessarily backward or primitive. Diversified applications of water power around the Mediterranean, as well as advances in water powered mining technology, the use of hydraulic mining techniques in the Spanish gold, and silver mines in the gigantic industrial scale on which those mines were worked in the first and second centuries. The existence of well organized commercial and banking networks and the widespread use of money are all indication of how much we tend to underestimate the sophistication of the Roman economy. This raises the issue. This was the olive oil. This raises the issue of labor and use of slavery. Slavery was an institution deeply rooted in the ancient world, both in the Mediterranean as well as even in the Near East. And not even Christianity, when it emerged in triumph as the state as the state religion, challenged this institution. Even Christianity as a religion could not challenge slavery. It does not follow the bulk of the labor in the Roman economy is performed by slaves. That may have been true of large parts of Italy in the Republican period, but it was no longer true of the empire as a whole. Slaves were an investment, and at least one Roman agricultural writer advised landowners against using them in contexts where too many might be required or where their health could be damaged. These considerations were not based on any sympathy for the slaves, but on hard economic calculation. On the other hand, if the Roman upper classes were often brutal towards their slaves, ordinary people did sometimes show much more compassion. On the treatment of slaves, one historian says about a famous incident that occurred in the reign of Nero. Soon afterwards, the city prefect, Lucius Pedanius Secundus, was murdered by one of his slaves. I'm reading a passage from the textbook. After the murder, the ancient custom required that every slave residing under the same roof must be executed. But a crowd gathered, eager to save so many innocent lives, and rioting began. The Senate House was besieged. Inside, there was a feeling against excessive severity, but a majority opposed any change. The senators favoring executions prevailed. However, great crowds ready with stones and torches prevented the order from being carried out. Nero rebuked the population by edict and lined with the troops the whole route along which those condemned were taken for execution. So many people were executed. This is just one passage by a historian. Warfare became less widespread with establishment of peace in the first century. The supply of slaves tended to decline, and the users of slave labor thus turned to either slave breeding or to cheaper substitutes such as wage labor, which was more easily dispensable. In fact, free labor was extensively used on public work at Rome precisely because an extensive use of slave labor would have been too expensive. Unlike hired workers, slaves had to be fed and maintained throughout the years, which increased the cost of holding this kind of labor. This is probably why slaves are not widely found in the agriculture of the latter period, at least not in the eastern provinces. On the other hand, they and freedmen, that is, slaves who had been freed by their masters, were extensively used as business managers where they were not required in large numbers. Masters very often gave their slaves or freedmen capital to run businesses on their behalf, or even the businesses of their own. The Roman agricultural writers paid a great deal of attention to the management of labor. Columella, a first century writer who came from the south of Spain, recommended that landowners should keep a reserve stock of implements and tools, twice as many as they needed, so that the production could be continuous. For the loss in slave labor, time exceeds the cost of such items. This was the general presumption among employers that without supervision, no work would ever get done. The supervision was paramount for both free workers and slaves. To make supervision easier, workers were sometimes grouped into gangs or smaller teams. Columella recommended squads of 10, claiming it was easier was putting in effort and who was not in work if the groups were of this type. This shows a detailed consideration of the management of labor. Pliny the Elder, the author of famous natural history, condemned the use of slave gangs as worst method of organizing production, mainly because slaves who worked together were usually chained together by their feet. All this looks very harsh, but we must remember that most factories in the world today enforce similar principles of labor control. Some industrial establishments in the empire enforced even tighter controls. Elder Pliny describes conditions in the Frankincense. Frankincense is a European name for an aromatic resin used in incense and perfumes. So he's saying that in frankincense factories of Alexandria, no amount of supervision seemed to suffice. A seal is put upon us, upon the workmen's aprons. They have to wear a mask or a net with close mesh on their heads. And before they are allowed to leave the premises, they have to take off all their clothes. Agricultural labor must have been fatigued and disliked. A famous edict of early 3rd century refers to Egyptian peasants deserting their village in order not to engage in agricultural work. Same is probably true of most factories and workshops. A law of 398 referred to workers being branded so they could be recognized if they ran away and tried to hide. Many private employers cast their agreements with the workers in the form of debt contracts to be able to claim that their employees were in debt to them and thus ensure tighter control over them. An early 2nd century writer tells thousands surrender themselves to work in servitude, although they are free. A lot of poor families went into debt bondage just in order to survive. One of the recent letters of Augustine, we learn that parents sometimes sold their children into servitude for a period of 25 years. Augustine asked a lawyer friend of his whether these children could be liberated once their father died. Rural indebtedness was even more widespread. In one example, in the Great Jewish Revolt of 66, the revolutionary destroyed the moneylenders' bonds to win popular support. We should be careful not to conclude that the bulk of labor was coerced in these ways. The late 5th century emperor Anastasius built the eastern frontier city of Dara in less than 3 weeks by attracting labor from all over East by offering high wages. From papyri, we can even form some estimate of how widespread wage labor had become in the parts of eastern Mediterranean by the 6th century. So with this, I end today's class. I'm not going to give you any questions to solve this time. Y'all can just make some notes and know about the controlling of workers. Meet you all next class. Till then, stay home and stay safe. Take care and keep learning.